And this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, tech gets off to a rough start in 2019. Does disappointing news from Apple and Tesla signal trouble ahead for the rest? Plus, the U.S. and China head into trade talks next week with a shared set of worries, volatile markets, and a macroeconomic slowdown. Will that strengthen desire to cut a deal? And Netflix is dominating new media. Goldman Sachs added the company to its conviction list of top stocks, while traditional cable companies are raising prices to offset cord cutting. First to our top story, it's been a short week starting off trading in 2019, but it hasn't been a slow one. To recap the travesty that has unfolded over the past couple of days, Apple sucker punched the market with a first quarter revenue cut that caught investors by surprise. Apple shares seeing their worst drop in almost 6 years. Suppliers in Asia also tumbling on the news. And even before the Apple news wreaked chaos, Tesla reported its own disappointing results. Here to discuss further, Bloomberg's cross-asset reporter Sarah Ponsek. So, Sarah, let's start with Tesla, as investors seem to think that the original sell-off was overdone.
Absolutely. Some investors are saying that original sell-off that we did see was overdone. We are seeing a bit of a bounce. We've seen almost a comeback since the first day of the year when we saw that really rough day for Tesla. But the fact of the matter is that we just keep seeing concerns surrounding the company. I mean, you're talking about a company that last year was down more than 30% at one point and then bounced back to end the year up 7%. So clearly a very volatile stock if you're going to play in it. But now what happened this time was they did put out Model 3 delivery numbers. They came in just below estimates. But what was really worrisome to some traders and investors, at least, was that they cut prices by $2,000 in the United States. So an analyst over at Wedbush said that this really came out of left field, throwing some investors off guard. We saw it in the stock price, the worst performer in the NASDAQ 100 when we came into the new year. So you're seeing that clearly. But it will be interesting to see where Tesla goes from here, seeing that it has been so resilient in the past.
So Apple really stole the show. Do investors think this is company specific, Apple, Tesla, or that other companies will be impacted?
So I've heard both sides. I've heard some investors looking at Apple and saying, look, if you're a long-term investor, Apple still looks valuable. But at the same time, this is an Apple issue. They largely blamed China, though, at the same time. So it does give you some evidence of what is going on in the back and forth between U.S. and China as it relates to trade and how that is actually filtering through to different consumer patterns, because consumers in China are just not going and buying iPhones anymore, it seems. But the fact of the matter is that Apple's not going to be the only company to cut revenue estimates or cut its earnings outlook. We even had the White House's Kevin Hassett come out and say, no, Apple is not alone. We should expect to see other companies lower their guidance until everything between the U.S. and China is figured out. And considering that so many tech companies have exposure to China, you would imagine that many of these companies could be the ones to do so.
Which companies are we talking about? Because many big tech companies, Facebook, Google, they don't have any business in China, or it's minuscule because they're not present in the country.
Exactly. It's not those other FANG names that you might imagine, but it is largely the semiconductor names. And I know we've all discussed this before, and you saw the fallout in these semiconductor names right after the Apple news was announced. We saw it filter through, spiral down the chain. Semiconductors are one of the worst performing industries in the S&P 500. And if you look at specific names like Broadcom, like NVIDIA, like KLA, Tencor, if you look at their exposure to China, they all have a very, very large amount. And not only are a lot of them also tied to Apple, it's just that they have business there as well. So you would expect to see it filter through those names as we have this week.
All right, Sarah Ponsek, thanks so much for weighing in. Another week. We'll see.
Another week.
Now, back in August, our colleague Tim Culpin in Taipei sounded a warning, saying storm clouds are brewing over the global tech industry. And while Apple got hit hard this week, Culpin is certain that the iPhone maker is among the healthiest in the sector. Take a listen.
Apple's stock totally tanked after Tim Cook came out and basically admitted that they weren't going to meet fourth quarter guidance. But you know what? The thing is, if you look at what's going on in the supply chain, Apple is better positioned than almost anyone else. I wrote a column back in August warning of storm clouds in the hardware supply chain. I looked at Foxconn, Wistron, Pegatron. They're the companies that supply to Apple and everybody else. Inventories are on the rise. They keep rising. I looked at the numbers again today. They've risen even further. Apple is the only company over the last year that's actually been cutting its inventory. So when they come out with these bad numbers, they're actually prepared for it more than anyone else. You look elsewhere in the supply chain, including Xiaomi, the Chinese company, their inventories have risen 90% year on year. Now, they're a fast-growing company, but they're not growing that fast. Again, at Honhai, Pegatron, Wistron, these are the Taiwanese companies that manufacture for everybody. They manufacture for Dell and HP, Nintendo, Sony, even Lenovo. These companies are seeing their inventories rise and rise and rise, despite the fact that everything is slowing down. So what we've seen with Apple is not the worst. There is going to be bad things to come, and what's going to happen eventually is that these inventories, because in the tech supply chain, inventories aren't worth much if they sit around for very long. At some point, companies are going to have to realize that they're not worth what they thought they were, and there's going to have to be asset write-downs. So I think that investors need to look out for what else is happening in the supply chain and be very, very careful of what's to come. I'm Tim Colpin for Bloomberg Opinion in Taipei.
So the big question is, if Apple's fate has turned just the first few days of the new year, what can other big tech companies expect going forward? To answer that, we are joined by Michael Pachter, Managing Director at Wedbush Securities. Great, Michael, to have you back here on the show. Is this bad news for Apple? Bad news for the rest of tech? Worse for some, better for others?
You said it right. I mean, the FANG stocks other than Apple have no real exposure to China. And I don't think, other than perhaps Google, Alphabet, that anybody expects any of the FANGs to be in China anytime soon. So I would say there's very little in their, in their market cap that reflects any kind of expectation of moving into China. So, China weakness is probably not going to impact any of them directly. I think, uncertainty over trade policy is an issue, and I think that's obviously it's a market issue. It drives concerns about, the potential for a recession. And that, to the extent that consumers are impacted by a recession, that's going to hit Netflix, that's going to hit Amazon. Facebook and Google less so, clearly, because they're not really consumer-driven, but they're advertiser-driven. Facebook has its own unique issues. Netflix has its own unique issues. And, so I think that those two have probably dropped more than the others, primarily because people are worried about security and safety and privacy with Facebook and the potential for government regulation, and they're worried about the continuing strong demand for streaming in the face of Disney launching its own service and pulling content from Netflix. Amazon is more, immune from that. Obviously, a weak consumer is going to hurt them, and Google, Alphabet is completely immune from that. So, you've seen in their share price declines, the ones that have gotten hit more are the ones with specific problems, and the ones that have gotten hit less have, lighter problems.
Now, if you look at the bigger picture, Apple has lost $445 billion in value since October 3rd. There are only 4 companies that are actually worth more than what Apple has lost: Amazon, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Berkshire Hathaway. Facebook isn't even on this list. I mean, when you look at the numbers, Michael, they really are dramatic. Does the market get better from here, or is there a ways to go down?
Well, I mean, the FANGs, including Apple, are, responsible for a giant chunk of market gains in the last few years, and they're clearly responsible for a giant chunk of the market decline in the last few months. So absolutely, the stocks that go down that have the biggest market cap have a greater impact on the overall market. I think some of these valuations are crazy, and I heard one of your earlier guests comment about Wedbush and Apple. That's my colleague Dan Ives. Dan thinks Apple is worth a ton. he thinks it's popping right back up to 200. I can see paying a relatively low multiple for a company like Apple, and Dan certainly believes that. Same with Facebook. Facebook's not going away. People aren't going to just turn off their accounts, not 2 billion of them. Amazon's not going away. There's no real competitive threat to Amazon. They're going to keep growing. Same with Alphabet. The one of the FANGs that I think has some risk is Netflix, because they don't own enough of the content that we watch. They own their originals are something like 35% of the hours viewed, but their owned originals are probably closer to 5%. So they're pretty vulnerable when Disney and Amazon start bidding up for content. It means that Netflix's costs are going to rise at the same time as their revenues are under pressure. So I've had to sell on this thing because I've seen the Matrix for the last 7 or 8 years, and it seems like the market is finally beginning to see it as well. But no, I think Apple's decline, this large loss of market cap, just tells you the bigger they are, the harder they fall.
Now, on Netflix, shares have always been volatile, but in the last 2 weeks, shares have spiked back up. Goldman just today put it on its conviction list, saying it's a top stock, and it's a very polarizing name. We had one guest earlier this week say Netflix could be the AOL of OTT, and another who completely disagreed. Why such binary views?
Yeah, I'm on one side of that. So, look, I think the simple analysis for Netflix is that they don't own very much content. Our count is that they own about 2% of the content on the service, and that's not enough to constitute a private label brand. So, at the end of the day, they're a retailer of other people's content, and their own stuff is 2% of what they've got, and they're not going to replace the other 98% for another decade or two. If Disney and Fox pull content, that's literally about 20% of everything on Netflix. If Warner and NBC Universal follow, that's the Hulu owners, then you're looking at more like 60% of all Netflix content. That's a problem. So they're super vulnerable because their suppliers can yank content. That's just not true of Amazon. Like, there's no chance any meaningful supplier is going to dent Amazon's sales and pull all their content. Yes, Louis Vuitton doesn't sell bags. Oakley doesn't sell sunglasses on Amazon, but they never have. Those guys are brands that are trying to protect pricing. Not true of just average vendors of iPhone power cords or Papermate pens. Those will be there.
You cover Facebook as well. Do you think Facebook will overcome its trust issues this year?
I think that they probably need to bring in an adult to run the company. I thought Sheryl Sandberg was that adult. She's been tainted lately. I think Zuckerberg's going to have to bring in somebody. We saw some speculation that it was Ken Chenault from American Express. It's going to be somebody who Wall Street has confidence in. And when that person says, "Trust me, I'll fix it," I think that investors will trust them to fix it. People don't trust Zuckerberg right now. He's said, "I'm sorry," every single time, and yet there's a new revelation almost every week. So if they bring in adult supervision, yes, I think that stock screams all the way back up to 200.
Zuckerberg has made a lot of apologies over the years. Michael Pachter, Wedbush Securities Managing Director, always great to have you back here.
Thank you, Emily.
Coming up, trade talks between D.C. and Beijing are set to resume next week. Just how will the recent tech turmoil impact negotiations? We will discuss. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. Listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. On Friday, President Trump's top economic advisor laid out what he thinks is necessary for upcoming trade talks between the U.S. and China to be successful. And, according to Larry Kudlow, one point may be of particular interest to Apple. Take a listen.
The whole issue of IP theft. By the way, that may be part of the Apple issue. I don't want to surmise too much here, but Apple technology may have been picked off by China, and now China is becoming very competitive with Apple. You got to have a rule of law.
To discuss, I want to bring in Isaac Stone-Fish in New York, senior fellow at the Asia Society. Isaac, what do you make of Kudlow's comment there?
Pretty striking comments, and it feels like he has something that he wants to say, but feels like he can't quite come out and say. He seems to be alluding to some sort of IP theft in China involving Apple, possibly, and I'm just speculating here, possibly involving Huawei, which is the largest cell phone producer in China and a company that's been very much in the news for the arrest of its CFO in December.
Well, and Xiaomi also has been accused for a long time of sort of copying Apple's designs, right?
Certainly, and you have the CEO of Xiaomi, Lei Jun, who likes the sort of turtleneck, Steve Jobsian way of giving presentations and has taken a lot from Apple as well. It does feel like with what the Trump administration is doing, Huawei is the target. If I had to guess, and again, just speculating here, that seems like comments more directed towards a company that has tighter state ties like Huawei as opposed to Xiaomi.
Okay, so that aside, these companies, Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo, are companies that are taking market share from Apple, outselling Apple in China, even as the Chinese smartphone market plateaus. How bad is it for Apple in China?
You know, I really, excuse me, I'm getting whatever sickness Apple is having in China. I don't think it's actually terrible. I think the expectations that people had were quite high and things are now coming down to earth. I think a really big issue Apple is facing is that people are not buying new phones after holding a phone. It used to be they'd have a phone for a year or two, then they'd want a new one, and now people are getting a little bit more used to the phone they're having. The newness has worn off. Chinese people are moving a little bit towards buying local brands, but I think for Apple, it's just a major global structural problem, and it's not just a China issue.
So you don't think it's just a brand issue in China?
No, I think it's more than that.
So let's talk about this trade issue, talks resuming next week. How optimistic are you with this new sort of twist in the story? Because Apple also employs a lot of people in China.
I think Apple should be very grateful that it is providing directly and indirectly thousands of jobs in China, because it really incentivizes the Chinese government to not let Apple in China go into a free fall. And I think it is something that companies across the spectrum have to realize. On the one hand, Trump wants them to come back and manufacture in the States. On the other hand, if they are manufacturing in China, it's a way to incentivize the Chinese government to keep letting them do business and doing it perhaps more successfully than they would otherwise.
Now, I have a chart here in the Bloomberg that shows how U.S. imports from China have grown over the last 20 years. It'll be interesting to see what this looks like when you add the 2019 data point. But, we're slowly getting more information about the impact of the trade war. Demand for Apple phones in China has fallen off a cliff. We don't know how much that actually has to do with trade. But, how do you think that impacts the dynamics of these discussions next week? Are you optimistic about a deal, and who does that deal favor?
I think the real question of who the deal favors is less to do with any concrete data and more to do with an issue of confidence. Is the U.S. side confident that the trade war is worse for China, or is the Chinese side confident that the trade war is worse for America? And right now, and sort of reading between the lines here, it feels like the American side is more confident and that the American economy just feels like it's in a better place than the Chinese economy. And I think if we do see a deal, it'll likely be one that broadly favors the United States. I think what we can say for sure, though, is that if we do see a deal, Trump will claim that it entirely favors the United States and that it's the deal of the century, the deal of a lifetime. And we'll get a lot of rhetoric surrounding what actually might be a very modest arrangement.
Just like he's the most popular Republican president in history, right?
Exactly.
Isaac Stone-Fish of the Asia Society, thank you as always for stopping by. Meantime, there has been a massive hack in Europe. The personal data of Chancellor Angela Merkel and hundreds of other German politicians has been released to the public. Bloomberg News' Stefan Nicola has more from Berlin.
Politicians' email addresses, their mobile phone numbers and personal chat transcripts That's just a small snippet of what was leaked in the hack, the biggest of its kind in Germany. It looks as though the hackers got the passwords to email, Facebook and Twitter accounts as a start and worked their way into getting more information from there. It's unclear who's behind the leaks as of now, which were published by a Twitter account claiming it's based in Hamburg. This is not a unique case. Germany has seen several breaches in the last few years, most notably the 2015 Bundestag parliamentary attack, where hackers roamed the network for more than a week before they were detected. The German government says it's taking today's attack very seriously, and pretty much all security agencies are involved. The Federal Office for Information Security, known as BSI, is heading the investigation into the data dump at its Cyber Defense Center. From Berlin, Stefan Nicola, Bloomberg News.
We'll keep watching that one. Coming up, another year, another increase to your cable bill. Will price hikes drive more subscribers to cut the cord? And Bloomberg Tech live streaming on Twitter. Check us out at Technology and follow our global breaking news network TikTok. On Twitter, this is Bloomberg. Walmart and Amazon are teaming up in India to lobby the government on e-commerce regulation. The companies are asking that a February 1st deadline to implement new rules be extended. The regulations require online marketplaces to treat all vendors equally, effectively barring foreign companies from featuring exclusive products on their platforms, which allows them to offer big discounts. Google continued to reduce its taxes for another year by taking advantage of loopholes. Bloomberg Law reports the company shifted $22.6 billion in 2017 to Bermuda through intercompany transactions flowing from a shell company in the Netherlands. Google has employed the same arrangement in prior years, going back to 2014. Irish law in 2015 stopped companies from taking advantage of such a structure, but companies with current structures like this can continue to use them till 2020. A Democratic U.S. presidential hopeful is going after Chinese telecom firm ZTE for hiring former Senator Joe Lieberman. Senator Elizabeth Warren asked whether it should be legal for Lieberman to lobby for the firm. President Trump is considering banning American companies from using ZTE equipment for national security reasons. A filing says Lieberman is looking into government concerns about security risk. And coming up, AI was tech's buzzword of 2018, but one tech veteran says we're going to hear less of it in 2019. We'll tell you why. Later in the program, meantime, Netflix having a fine time on Wall Street, but it's also got a cash burn problem. That's coming up. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg Technology, I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. It has been a rough week for Apple following news that it cut its revenue outlook for the first time in 2 decades. Apple stock plunging the most in almost 6 years as the company cited struggling iPhone sales in China. Investors, though, are concerned the company's flagship product, which accounts for 2/3 of its revenue, may be losing its luster more broadly. Here to discuss, Phil Libin, CEO and co-founder of All Turtles, an AI startup. He's also an advisor at the venture capital firm General Catalyst. So, Phil, when it comes to Apple, is it all bad news?
No, I certainly don't think so. I think it's kind of mixed. You know, Apple is one of the most iconic and globally integrated companies in the world, so it's going to be particularly susceptible to disruption and to politics, and there's some things that are going well for it and some things that are, I think, going poorly.
So what's the good news? We've talked a lot about the bad news.
Well, I think the good news is, I think there's at least two recently. One is it really feels like Apple is on the right side of history, so to speak, in terms of their approach to privacy. which is very different from Facebook and Twitter and Google, because Apple's fundamental business model is they just want you to buy more of their hardware. People aren't going to buy expensive phones more if they're agitated or nervous, so Apple has no business interest in actually stirring up any kind of anxiety. They just want people relatively happy and prosperous so they can buy their products. Facebook and Google and Twitter have an indirect business model. It's all about getting people to engage, getting people to click, getting people to heightened emotional states. And I think 2018 was basically the story of how that's pretty bad for the world. So big picture, Apple's on the right side of that fight.
So, okay, let's talk a little bit more about Apple, then we'll move to Facebook. But this is a company that is trying to sell $3,000 plus phones in China. And yes, they're transitioning to a services model, but those services, growth in those services depend on people buying iPhones.
Yeah, and they haven't had a major new type of product, like the iPhone is a major advance since the iPhone. And, it's overdue over the next couple of years. Like, there's only so long that they can keep writing the same product. There's this famous definition of what an innovative company is, which is what percentage of their revenue is coming from products that just didn't exist 5 years earlier. And 5 years ago, Apple would have been very high in that ranking because most of their revenue is coming from iPhone, which 5 years before that hadn't existed. But now it's getting a little bit less so. So they do need to, I think, start coming up with some more innovative products over the next couple of years, new categories, so that 5 years from now, a lot of their revenue is coming from products that
and
don't
yet
exist.
You're very excited about the Apple Watch.
Yeah.
But, it's not going to become the iPhone anytime soon or ever, right?
No, I think the second good news for Apple is a lot of their secondary products, like this current generation of the iPad, the current generation of the Apple Watch, the products are finally fulfilling their potential, their promise, and so I actually expect sales of those to really pick up over the next couple of years. The Apple Watch in particular is the first mainstream generation of what I think of as the wearables 2.0 market. These are medical devices or devices that have really good health applications that, unlike the 1.0 versions, actually do something useful. I think all the heart stuff in the new Apple Watch is actually fundamentally important, and there's probably other stuff coming that'll be medically transformative for lots of people. So I think there's good news on the device front as well.
Meantime, do you think, you talked about how Facebook and Google may be on the wrong side of history. So what does that mean, over, let's say, the next 5 years? What happens to those businesses?
Well, the way I like to look at it is how aligned is the money engine of a company with its stated mission and purpose. And for companies like Apple, it's pretty aligned. Like, Apple wants to, make and sell you really desirable phones and other products. At Amazon, it's fairly aligned. Amazon wants you to buy stuff from Amazon. Facebook is pretty unaligned at this point. They make money exclusively by trying to collect as much information about you as possible, information that most people don't actually want, even if they don't go out of their way to prevent it, collected about them, and then using that information to target stuff to you and to resell it and to show you ads. That's a big disconnect. So I think Facebook is going to have a hard time remaining at its current size in terms of market cap, having all of the businesses that it has lumped together.
Well, it's already sub $400 billion. It's hard to believe.
Yeah, I think there's a good question about whether or not the ad business and the data business and the social networking business in Facebook and the messaging business all belong in the same company, just because they're all backed up by the fact that they're just harvesting and selling data, and that may just become politically and from a business perspective untenable. So.
Do you think Facebook will, and Facebook of course also has Instagram, but do you think that either or both will be challenged by an upstart social network in terms of usage?
Yeah, I think so. I think that always happens every few years. It's rare for a company to stay fashionable for decades. So yeah, and I think we're already seeing things. We're seeing things in China that are more about short form video format that are really starting to challenge the established social media networks there. Yeah, I think we'll see disruption over the next couple of years.
So all of these companies use AI and have been trying to exploit AI, building AI. But you think we're going to hear less about AI this year than we did last year? Why?
I think so, because I think we're going to make this transition where people actually see real understandable products that are used building AI, which we haven't really seen up to now. Up to now, AI has been this thing that people talk about, they don't really understand, that they're kind of scared of. There's a lot of deep tech, there's a lot of talk about generalized AI and it becoming super smart and taking over the world. And a lot of that is because there's this vacuum of actual things that people can point to and say, this is a smart product and it's great and we understand why it exists. And I think you're just going to start seeing a lot of those, the first few this year. So AI will because it will succeed so much, because it will integrate itself into the fabric of pretty much all of our products, will stop being a thing. Now, just like .com stopped being a thing.
That said, there's been talk about the AI hype cycle being, out of control, and that AI isn't actually delivering on its promise.
Right.
What do you think of that criticism?
Yeah, because I think most people have no idea what the promise is, right? If you ask someone, what is the promise of AI? They probably say something like, make a computer that's as smart as a person or smarter than a person. But that's a weird promise. Like, why is that a good thing? What's the purpose of it? Who really wants this? I think what AI is doing is making a whole generation of new products that are the products themselves are very easy to understand, possible, that just weren't possible before. And people, I think, are starting to see that, and we'll see more of it this year.
So you make AI products at All Turtles. What kinds of AI-based products are you most excited about, and how will they change our lives?
So our criteria is all the products we work on, and we have 10 right now, have to be explainable in 1 or 2 sentences.
We love that.
For example, one is called Spot, which is now publicly available, and it's an AI for workplace harassment and discrimination reporting, because workplace harassment and discrimination sucks to report for the person experiencing the harassment, for the company, for everyone. There's an AI that makes that a much easier process for everyone. It couldn't have been built without the AI technology, but it itself is just a fundamental, simple to understand, simple to use product with straightforward economics. So we focus on AI products that solve a real problem. They're easy to explain, that are buildable now.
All right, Phil Libben, CEO of All Turtles. Always great to have your thoughtful analysis here on the show. Really appreciate you stopping by.
Thanks, Emily.
Well, Tesla is close to winning approval to start selling its Model 3 electric car in Europe. Bloomberg has learned the company expects to receive certification after some authorities return from the holidays. Selling the Model 3 in Europe is a priority for Tesla CEO Elon Musk. He is targeting potential customers of the BMW 3 Series as well as the Volkswagen Golf. Coming up, Netflix bouncing back from its December lows. Just what is fueling the FANG standout? We'll discuss next. This is Bloomberg. Cable and satellite subscribers, beware. Providers including Comcast, Dish, and AT&T's DirecTV are planning to raise rates again. Comcast, the largest cable company in the U.S., is raising its fee for broadcast channels by $2 a month, while DirecTV is raising fees by $3 to $8. The latest price hikes could risk alienating even more subscribers as consumers increasingly turn to cheaper online options like Netflix and Hulu. Cameron Leach covers media and tech at Bloomberg, joins us now from New York. So Cameron, if people are cutting the cord, why raise rates again?
Honestly, that's a very fair question. Generally, I would say this is not a huge problem as cable companies do this each year. However, at a time where consumers are preferring to go to a Netflix or preferring to go to a YouTube TV, this is something that is very alarming and that CEOs should, kind of pay attention to.
So what's the strategy? I mean, is there a reason to it?
Generally, you would think that this is something that is super bad, but I don't think this is anything that is out of the norm. This time, this may not be something that's specific to the cable industry. I had a chance to speak to a top investor of Comcast, one of my sources at ClearBridge, and they say this is not something that is just for cable companies. This is something that may actually transpire over to, say, streaming companies like a YouTube TV as well, where broadcasting and transmission fees may increase also.
So let's take a longer-term view. What happens in a post-Netflix world when there are so many OTT providers you can't keep track? You go to Netflix for one thing, Apple, Disney,
yes,
Amazon, Hulu for something else. You go to your cable company less and less. But will consumers want some sort of consolidation?
That's a good question. I mean, we're also looking at a Comcast who also owns NBC, and they're thinking about launching their own OTT service also. So if users are leaving traditional cable companies and going to OTT services, maybe that's not hurting a Comcast. Maybe they're going to their OTT service as well.
So what else are cable companies do to sort of stem the bleeding?
That's a question that I think they're also trying to find out themselves.
So how, up to this point, have they avoided these price hikes or tried to avoid making price hikes?
Well, you look at a Disney who's also trying to, launch their own OTT service. They're giving the ESPN Plus. They're giving the Disney Plus. They're trying their best to really circumvent and go to where viewers are actually at.
All right. Well, another year, another cable bill. Bloomberg's Cameron Leach, thanks so much for joining us. Well, among the FANG stocks, there is one currently standing above its peers, and that is Netflix. The streaming giant rose for the 6th time in 7 sessions, meaning its shares have jumped at least 25% since lows back in December. One thing going in Netflix's favor, a vote of confidence from Goldman Sachs. Analysts at the firm called it, quote, one of the best risk-reward propositions in the internet sector. Here to tell us more, Bloomberg Tech's Eric Newcomer, who wrote about the company in this Friday's Fully Charged newsletter. Now, we talked earlier about how Goldman added Netflix today to its conviction list of top stocks, but you point out Netflix's cash flow problem, which is kind of a big deal.
It's a huge number, right? I mean, it was about $2 billion last year. It's projected to be about $3 billion. I mean, it's
$3 billion in negative cash flow.
Exactly. It sounds shocking. I think the rationalization is that, it is spending money now for what it plans to be a much bigger business in the future, right? It's an investment for when it has sort of more users, more reach. You start the content pipeline today, and it takes several years for that to pay off.
And yet you've got some very binary views on Netflix's future. We were just talking to one analyst who thinks, the only way to go is down.
Right.
And yet certainly many investors think otherwise. You have some ideas about how Netflix can fix its cash flow problem.
Right. I think you sort of have to think backwards with Netflix. It's, if you assume the strategy is to become the best content company in a generation, then you pay whatever it takes to get that content. And that's just a bidding war. And then it's a matter of how do you price that? And there are clear options for Netflix to sort of price discriminate between customers. If you take Disney doesn't just sell you a ticket to Star Wars. If you're a super fan, you buy sort of a toy, you go to a theme park, you watch Clone Wars on Netflix. There are tons of ways for Disney to monetize brands from sort of the lay consumer to somebody who's super hardcore. And right now, Netflix's strategy is just one price for everybody. And so clearly there's opportunity for them to sort of find ways to sort of tax their super user more and start making more money from the content they put out.
So how so? The more I watch, the more I pay?
Right. I think it's not metered pricing. I think it's things like Disney. I mean, you could do merchandising. You could have a higher end tier like HBO, right? You have sort of your regular tier, but then you have premium shows. So there are different ways to do it besides just saying, oh, you're watching 10 shows, we're going to charge you more than someone watching 2.
But Netflix isn't going to be starting a Stranger Things theme park anytime soon. I mean, what are the options that would be available to a company like this?
I mean, this is all speculative, but they literally just hired somebody with a CFO with experience working in Disney, a company with theme parks. Like, I think anything like that down the road is possible because these companies are fundamentally creating sort of content that can be monetized in all sorts of ways. And I think just sticking to, okay, we're only going to have a streaming fee is a very limited way to think about a company that's fundamentally competing with Disney, Blizzard, Activision, companies that monetize in all sorts of ways.
Now, one of the problems we talked about earlier is that Netflix actually owns a very small percentage of the original content that you can find.
Right. I mean, and that's another way that sort of costs can start making more sense, right? Obviously, Netflix had a strategy where they were taking outside content, and now they're trying to bring that more and more in-house, which allows them to control the costs and see the upside in the long term. So the switch to more in-house content gives Netflix more control over its own cost structure.
And I wonder if there's a sort of quality versus quantity issue here. I mean, there's been a lot of jokes about just how much you can find on Netflix.
Right.
I mean, you have a conversation with someone about their favorite Netflix shows, and often I've never heard of them.
Right.
Because there are just so many shows, and I wonder, would some consolidation or weeding out be in Netflix's favor, or no? Is it just about trying to?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the point is that there is so much content for people, and there are people, you think about watching The Office, like there are people watching over and over again. I mean, you could monetize those people so much more by trying to find sort of, premium. You could send them bonus content. There's all sorts of stuff that you could sell to them to sort of upsell them on the amount they're already consuming Netflix.
Interesting. All right, so you're predicting a Stranger Things theme park 2019?
Not that soon, but I don't think it's as crazy as you think it is.
Okay, Bloomberg's Eric Newcomer, always good to have you. Still ahead, as the holiday season winds down, retailers are now facing a surge of returns. How the industry is using tech to streamline this issue. This is Bloomberg. Shares of GameStop rose in Friday's trading session on M&A chatter. According to the Wall Street Journal, private equity firms Sycamore Partners and Apollo Global are bidding for the video game retailer. The report says a deal could be announced by the middle of next month. Well, now that holiday gifts have been bought, given, received, retailers brace themselves for returns. It's turning into a big problem, as many returned items never make it back to store shelves, but to landfill. As more customers shop online and return more goods, a number of companies are developing tech to tackle the issue. Bloomberg's Emma Chandra spoke with Tobin Moore, CEO of Optoro, and a specialist in what is known as reverse logistics.
This year, we're predicting that there'll be $390 billion of goods returned in the U.S., and that number has been growing fairly significantly over the last several years with the growth of e-commerce. So we see the e-commerce return rate at roughly triple that of brick and mortar, which is pushing the overall return rate up. And then on top of it, it's even more complex now because people like to buy goods online and often return those goods to storefronts if it's possible. So you have to deal with an omni-channel world of returns, and stores are now getting back goods that they never sold in the first place and that they may not even keep in stock because their online catalogs are much larger than what they keep in the store.
And so this is, of course, where Optoro steps in. You have a software and you're using technology that you then sell to retailers so that they can better manage this returns process. Tell us how it works.
Yeah, so the dark side of returns being easier and all these goods being bought online is an explosion in returns, which has been very costly for retailers. So we help them in a couple areas. One, we do make the returns experience easier. So we give them technology that streamlines the processing of returns and makes it so a return can happen faster, so a refund can occur faster, and then so the operational costs of actually processing those goods can be a lot more efficient. Two, we help them, once the return comes back, to route the good to its next best home as efficiently as possible. So in the past, a lot of returns would end up, the new ones would be put back on the shelf, and the rest would end up going into this black hole where goods would end up being liquidated for pennies on the dollar or actually going into landfills. So what we do is when that good comes back, our technology looks at why that item's being returned, what was wrong with it, what's the condition it's in, and what is the specific item in terms of where it is location-wise. It then looks at where can it be resold in that condition. So can it be resold at your storefront, at an outlet store, online, to secondary markets online if it's used through eBay or Amazon, through B2B channels? Can it be sent to charities? Can it be sent to recyclers if it's broken for parts? And so it looks at how much each of those channels will pay for that good and how much it costs to get there. And then our algorithms determine which channel to send it to and actually start routing it through the channels to that final destination.
And ultimately, the retailers involved are recouping some of the costs that perhaps they weren't able to before.
Yep. Yeah. So at the end of the day, the retailers save a lot of money on the process being streamlined. So on the operations side, they get more money by a higher yield by picking the right price point and the right channel as soon as possible to send that good to. They save a ton of waste. We really focus on trying to make it so none of these goods end up in landfills, so we can reduce the amount of waste created by up to 70% in many cases for the retailers.
So who are your customers then? Who are the retailers that are using the software and the technology that you've developed?
Yeah, so we work with typically the bigger, well-known retailers and brands out there. Some of them include Target, Staples, Groupon, Jet, and BJ's Wholesale, to name a few of them. In general, we're targeting both retailers and the brands that are selling the goods through them, because they're both responsible in the returns ecosystem.
You founded the company about 8 years ago. You've raised hundreds of millions of dollars and just closed your Series E funding round. You've got some big name investors behind you. What's next for Optoro?
Yeah, so we're focused on continuing to grow and scale our technology to the entire industry. We want to help tie together the ecosystem between retailers and brands, and we want to help leverage the data more and more so that we can help prevent returns from happening in the first place and really focus on creating a better customer experience.
And is that data side of things perhaps the next growth area for Optoro?
It's an area we've always been focused on, but as we continue to grow, I think we want to leverage more insights from that area that we can offer to help retailers and brands in the first place. At the end of the day, a lot of waste is created from these returns, and the more that we can prevent them from happening, both the better customer experience and the less waste that we can create out there.
Looking 10 years into the future, hopefully you've prevented all kinds of returns from even happening. But if that doesn't happen, what do you see Optoro becoming? Do you see you becoming a public company? Do you see you becoming acquired by a bigger company, perhaps by a big retailer? Is there something that you see that is particularly on the cards for Optoro?
Yeah, we're not as focused on the exit strategy as on the opportunity in the industry. I mentioned there's going to be $390 billion of returns this year. It's growing in the next couple of years. It'll be $500 billion of returns a year in the U.S. and over $1 trillion a year worldwide. So I see us being global, being hopefully the industry standard at that point, reducing the amount of waste that is caused in retail, both financially and physically in the environment at that point.
Tobin Moore there, Optoro CEO, with our own Emma Chandra. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Next week, be sure to tune in for our coverage of CES, the Consumer Electronics Show. We've got a great lineup. IBM CEO Ginny Rometty, Verizon CEO Hans Vestberg, and Bob Pittman, the CEO of iHeartMedia. We are, of course, live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology and follow our Global Breaking News Network TikTok on Twitter. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. This is Bloomberg.